So welcome back to episode 2, where I am transforming this guest bedroom into not only our guest bedroom, but also my new home office. So I recently put up a feature wall in our guest bedroom to this. I have episode 1 of how I did it available here if you want to check it out. And now it's time to work on a desk for this space. It is pretty awkward. It's a long and narrow space, but I found a really cool old provincial piece on Facebook Marketplace for $20, so I decided to go pick it up. After I got it back and into my garage, I realized how incredibly dirty it was, and it's really damaged too. It happens all the time on Facebook Marketplace. You never know what you're really going to get until you get it home and truly examine it. The veneer was peeling on the top. There were so many dings and dents, but I had a fun design in mind for it. So I started by removing all the drawers, but one drawer in particular was incredibly stuck. I honestly could not get this thing out. I had to go grab a mini pry bar to try to force it out because there was no way that I could get it out any other way. And you'll soon realize that I either damaged the drawer in the process or the drawer was damaged and that's why it was stuck. I don't know, but it was super upsetting to find. I hate when drawers are damaged.
What was that stuck on? Oh my gosh. Aww.
After I was done being sad about this drawer, I grabbed my vacuum and tried to get all of the loose dust out of this desk. This was one of the dirtiest pieces I've ever worked on, so I grabbed some Dish Dawn power spray and just sprayed the entire piece with it to try to really get rid of all of that caked on grease and grime. And I found that Dish Dawn soap does a fantastic job to do this, and this power spray just makes it really easy to apply. I had to do a couple of rounds of this Dish Dawn spray, and you could just see the dirt and grime rolling off of this piece. I'm not kidding when I said it's really, really dirty, and you can just see how effective this Dish Dawn spray really was. So after I finished scrubbing it down with Dish Dawn soap and wiping it off with water, I grabbed some odor bully because the desk still had a really nasty smell to it. And I've heard this stuff is great. So the way that I applied it is I sprayed it all over the entire piece and then wiped it back with a damp cloth. And when I flipped the piece over to spray the inside, I realized I didn't scrub it very well. So I just grabbed a brush and scrubbed it and rinsed it off with some water. After I finished applying this odor bully literally everywhere on this desk, I let it dry in the sun until it was completely dry and I can continue working on it. And honestly, the smell was completely gone. I also did the drawers. I didn't videotape it, but they were stinky too, so I scrubbed all of that. And speaking of drawers, it was time to fix the broken drawer that just would not come out. And look how dirty this inside is. You can kind of get a peek at it right there. Oh my gosh, this thing was so nasty. But before I sanded it clean, I wanted to fix and repair it. And the way that I did that was I grabbed some wood glue, put it in each of those dovetail sections, and use some wood clamps to clamp and hold it together while the wood glue dries. So before moving on to sanding those nasty drawers, I wanted to remove the peeling veneer. So I grabbed my 2 favorite tools to do this, which is a heat gun, which is used to melt the glue holding the veneer on, and then a painter's tool to pry off the veneer as the heat gun melts that glue. And you're gonna wanna be very careful when using a heat gun because it gets incredibly hot. You do not wanna hold this in one place for any long period of time, and long being more than a couple of seconds, because it will catch your wood on fire. Trust me, I have done and learned this from experience. So some of this veneer was incredibly stuck. You have to have a lot of patience when removing veneer because it can take a long time to get it all off. And I guess I just didn't have much patience to that day when I was doing it because I gave up before going over to social media to see if anyone had any quicker ideas on how to remove this really stuck on veneer. And everyone said to use a damp cloth and an iron. This will create a steam that will hopefully melt the glue as well. It worked to a certain extent, but it really didn't get it all. So then I grabbed my heat gun once more and got the remaining veneer off. So I think a combination of everything that I did helped get this veneer off, but it was still incredibly frustrating. So unfortunately, when I was using that mallet and my painter's tool, I did gouge some of the wood, so I would need to fix that. But first, I needed to sand that top to get any of those other kind of small pieces of veneer that were still glued on there. And a great way to do that is just grab your orbital sander. I used 120 grit sandpaper here and just sanded until all those pieces were off and ready to repair those gouges. And I really wanted to keep a natural wood top, but the wood underneath was just damaged from me and I didn't like the look of it. So I knew I wanted to apply a new sheet of veneer. And veneer is just a thin sheet of wood. But before I did that, I needed to fix those gouges because those gouges would show through that new sheet of veneer. So you want to make your surface nice and smooth. And the way that I did that was applying some Bondo to those areas and then just sanding it smooth with 120 grit sandpaper until it was smooth. And you can see that I actually had to go do another round of Bondo because there were some still other imperfections, including that knotted wood piece in this surface here. And you really just want a nice flat surface before you apply veneer. Before I applied the veneer, I wanted to paint the body of the desk. And the way that I prep my desk for paint is I sand it all over with 220 grit sandpaper. I like to use 220 grit because it still scuffs up the surface enough for your paint to have something to grab onto and really adhere well to, but it keeps your surface nice and smooth so you get that perfect finish whenever you do end up painting it. So I got a little distracted while I was sanding and decided I wanted to cut an arch in that middle piece there. I thought that trim just didn't fit the style and an arch would make it more modern. So I grabbed my jigsaw and attempted to cut an arch, but it did not go very well. And then I stepped back and realized I didn't like the look of an arch at all. So I decided to just completely remove that middle piece of trim. It wasn't structurally holding anything together. It was just decorative. So I used that paint tool and my mallet again and loosened up that middle piece before removing it completely. So there were some nails that were holding that trim in and I needed to cut those out because there was no other way to remove them. So I grabbed my Dremel oscillating tool with a metal cutter attachment and just shaved off those nails. I then grabbed my orbital sander and sanded those areas smooth before continuing to sand the rest of the desk. I then grabbed my Surf Prep sander, and this is a detailed sander that can get in and do those curved areas too if you have a foam attachment pad. I will link my sander below, but they also sell these foam attachment pads to fit most other sanders, so you can just purchase that. I have a code, I'll link it below to save you some money, but I sanded all of those areas with my Surf Prep. I also sanded those drawers, but I completely forgot to film it. I wasn't able to get all of the stains out of that one nasty drawer, but I apply drawer liners to all of my drawers, so it's a nice coverage even if you can't get every bit of that stain out of there. It was finally time to prime the desk, and I first started off by taping off that top part because I wanted to leave that natural wood and veneer the top. It didn't matter if I got some primer on that top there because again I'm covering it with veneer, so I didn't worry about covering that. I use this spray primer and it's an oil-based primer. Great coverage and it's super easy to use. I will link that can attachment down below too because it's a fun tool to have. So I actually had some paint left over from the feature wall that I showed you early on and thought it would be a great compliment to the space, but spoiler alert, I didn't like it once I got into the room. It matched a little too well, but more on that later. I used my favorite paint sprayer to apply this paint, and I always filter out my paint before I spray it. This is a necessity because otherwise you're going to get some sputtering that you will often see when people use paint sprayers and they haven't strained it, because there are so many clumps or even just small particles that can get stuck in your sprayer. Afterwards, I moved on to applying the sheet of veneer.
I have this fresh sheet of oak veneer, and veneer is, again, just a very thin sheet of wood. This veneer is on paper backing, and the way that I'm going to apply it is by using contact cement. Again, I've never tried this either. I'm a little nervous, not gonna lie, because veneer is expensive. It's a nice quality sheet of wood. I think this ran about $30 or $40. I will double check and link below what sheet of veneer I'm using, but you want to get it right. So there's no room for error unless you want to buy a new sheet, which I don't want to do. So I'm going to be using this contact cement and applying it with a foam roller. And after you apply it, I'm going to be using this tool to push down any of those air bubbles out of that veneer so it adheres really, really well. And let's get started.
So I grabbed a tape measure and measured the desktop size so that I could cut the size of veneer that I needed, and I wanted to have a 1/2 inch overlay on the entire surround, so a 1/4 inch on each side. So I just added up those measurements, marked them, and then we'll go cut that veneer. So the way that you cut veneer is pretty simple. You just need a straight edge and a box cutter, preferably a really sharp box cutter. Mine was not sharp, and you'll see that I had to do a lot of passes when I went to cut this thing, but it still worked. But just make sure you have that straight edge so that you're getting that nice straight line. This is a part that you don't want to mess up because veneer is actually really expensive. So just take your time measuring and cutting here. So then it was time to apply the contact cement, and you want to make sure that you have all the safety equipment necessary, definitely some gloves, some eye protection, and I mixed it up in a plastic tray so I could just toss that afterwards because it will be ruined, trust me. And I used a foam roller and just rolled it on the back paper surface of that veneer, and you want to get a nice even layer here when you're applying this contact cement. And I just made sure that I applied to every surface of that veneer. You don't want to miss a spot here. And then I took the contact cement over to the desktop and applied a layer of contact cement where the veneer will be applied to it. And I wanted to make sure I did not miss any sections on this too, because you want the veneer to stick to everything, including the corners. That's where it peels up the most, so you want to make sure you definitely get the corners. I let the contact cement dry for a couple of hours and then went back out and applied a second coat to both the veneer and the desktop. Now, a lot of people say that you don't need 2 coats, but the YouTube video I watched encouraged you to do 2 coats to really ensure ultimate adhesion. I would also do that just because I know how easily veneer peels up. That's why we had to remove that old sheet, so I wanted to do everything I could to make sure this veneer stuck. And then I let it dry for another couple of hours.
So I am getting ready to apply the veneer to the desktop, and the way that I'm going to do it and the way that contact cement works is anything that does not have contact cement on it will not stick to it. So it makes it actually pretty easy to apply using dowels. So any type of wood to keep it from touching the surface. As soon as it touches, it sticks. That is the joy and also the negative. So you have to get it right, which is why these wood sticks come in handy, because you're able to align it the way that you want it and pull them out as you go and apply that even pressure. So I am going to make sure that these are dust free so nothing gets on the surface as I'm applying this veneer, and go ahead and get started. I'm trying to line up the veneer so that it is right where it needs to go before removing these dowels and starting to apply that pressure. So I'm going to use this tool to really apply a lot of pressure going with the grain as I attempt to really attach this veneer to this surface.
So I actually ended up grabbing my J roller and doing another final pass. I really just wanted to make sure I did everything possible to make sure that this veneer stuck to the surface and there were no air bubbles. So after the veneer was on, I let it dry for a whole night. I wanted to make sure that this contact cement had time to really cure before I went and trimmed off that excess there that you see. All right, so it's a new day and I am going to start by using my router to trim the edges. It's going to be the quickest, most accurate way in my opinion, especially with those curves on the front that I have to go around. You could also use like an X-Acto knife, a really sharp one, and trim those edges just like I cut it with. But I think a router's the best way if you have one. If you don't, again, X-Acto knife will work. Okay, I spoke too soon on the router, unfortunately, because I need a flat line here, and because it comes in, you can kind of see how it goes in there, so I need to just trim that part without touching this part. And the way the router works, it will touch this part before it cuts off this. I don't know if that makes any sense, but short version is it's just not going to work. So I'm going to go to option 2, and that is with my X-Acto knife. So you get to see that. On the back piece, the router did work because it's a flat surface. So it just went around and trimmed it super quick. Fortunately, it's not going to work on this side. So I'm going to try this method and hopefully it works. It's a really jaggedy cut, but we're gonna make it work. So I grabbed my detail sander and used 220 grit sandpaper and went in at an angle, kind of like that 45 degrees, so it can kind of shave off and smooth out the rest of that veneer surface there that's really jaggedy from my awful cuts. I don't know if this is the way that you should do it, but this method worked for me. Afterwards, I grabbed a sanding block and 220 grit sandpaper and just kind of hand sanded there until it was a nice smooth edge. So this method did work and it looks great. It just took a lot longer than a router would. But hey, it worked out in the end. So it was then time to stain the veneer. I love a nice deep dark stain, so I used Proventional by Minwax and stained it with a staining pad. I love staining pieces with a staining pad. It just goes on so much better. So highly recommend those whenever you need to stain anything. And I loved this dark color. I grabbed a favorite top coat of mine. I like using it on wood surfaces. I haven't tried it on painted surfaces yet, but love it on wood. And I actually did 3 coats of this. I wanted to make sure it was extra protected. And just a reminder of what this desk looked like before. It was in really rough shape, and I love showing the before we show the after to what it looks like now. I mean, this thing is a complete 180 from what it was, and I couldn't love it anymore. I did add some fun drawer liners and used some rub and buff on the original hardware to give it that gold look. But my problem is, once I got it into the space, look how much it matches that wall, which can be a good thing, but in my case, it matched too well. And honestly, when I was standing in the room, I just did not like it. And it broke my heart because I thought this was the perfect piece. I loved it by itself, but just not in its room. So unfortunately, this desk did not work out, and I'm gonna have to come up with a plan B, which I did, and I will show you what that is in another episode. But let me know what you think of this final look and if you think that it looked right in this room or not. And thanks so much for watching. Please subscribe for more fun furniture makeovers and DIY.